It was just another humid afternoon in Tallahassee, Florida, when a routine traffic stop spiraled into something that would shake the community to its core. The sun was high, the streets were quiet, and everything appeared normal. Officer Nathaniel Briggs, known for his strict demeanor and assertive approach, was patrolling the northwest side of the city when he noticed a black sedan with an expired license plate. With little hesitation, he flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. Inside the vehicle was 29-year-old Tamka Rollins, a single mother of two on her way home from work. According to the incident report filed later, Briggs approached the vehicle with suspicion and immediately began questioning Tamka in a tone that witnesses described as aggressive. She attempted to explain her situation calmly, mentioning that her tag renewal had been delayed due to financial difficulties. But the conversation didn't remain civil for long. Witnesses claimed that Briggs became increasingly hostile, accusing Tamka of being uncooperative, even though she had not refused any instructions. One bystander began recording on their phone. From across the street, within moments, things escalated. Briggs ordered Tamka out of the car. She complied, stepping onto the curb. The next few seconds were brutal. The footage, later circulated online, showed Briggs grabbing Tamka by the arm and forcefully spinning her toward the back of his cruiser. Without clear provocation, he slammed her head against the car's rear door with such force that she immediately crumpled to the ground. She wasn't moving. Chaos erupted on the street. People screamed, cars stopped, and several witnesses rushed toward the scene in disbelief. Briggs called for backup and medical assistance, but showed no urgency or remorse. His expression remained cold and unshaken, even as Tamka lay unconscious on the pavement. EMTs arrived minutes later and transported her to the hospital, where doctors reported she had suffered a skull fracture and internal bleeding. She was placed in a medically induced coma while surgeons attempted to relieve the pressure on her brain. By that evening, the video of the assault had gone viral. News stations picked up the footage, and hashtags demanding justice for Tamka flooded social media platforms. Crowds began gathering outside the police department by nightfall, holding signs and chanting her name. Protesters demanded accountability, transparency, and answers. The department responded by placing Briggs on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. But this move only fueled public outrage. As the pressure mounted, Tamka's family released a statement pleading for prayers and justice. Her mother described her as a loving daughter and devoted mother who had never been in trouble with the law. Civil rights activists began arriving in the city, holding press conferences and calling for an independent investigation. Community leaders, pastors, and attorneys joined the movement, warning that this was not just about one woman, but about a pattern of unchecked violence in law enforcement. Local news anchors struggled to keep up with the developments. What started as a minor traffic violation had quickly become a national firestorm. Behind the scenes, officials scrambled to contain the fallout. Calls poured in from state representatives and journalists demanding clarity. The police department issued a vague statement about protocol and officer safety, but it was clear that public trust was eroding fast. While Tamka lay in critical condition, unconscious and fighting for her life, the city of Tallahassee held its breath, unaware that the story was about to take a chilling turn. No one could have predicted that. As the days passed after the brutal incident, the city of Tallahassee found itself caught in a storm of anger and confusion. Tamka Rollins remained in the hospital, her condition fluctuating between stable and critical. Outside, protests grew larger. Community leaders and activists refused to let the case fade into silence. Pressure mounted on the Tallahassee Police Department to act, but what came next only deepened the crisis. An anonymous email was sent to a local news outlet with a single sentence: "Look into Briggs's record." Attached were 2 internal documents and a list of complaint numbers. What the reporters uncovered was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Officer Nathaniel Briggs had a long history of violent encounters during his career. Over the past 11 years, he had been the subject of 17 excessive force complaints. Each time, the official reports cleared him of any wrongdoing. Some cases were dismissed without a proper investigation, others quietly settled. Most never reached the public. The victims, many of whom were Black or Latino, had filed statements describing beatings, verbal abuse, and threats. Several were hospitalized after encounters with Briggs. And yet, somehow, his record remained spotless on paper. The more reporters dug, the more questions surfaced. Why was Briggs allowed to stay on the force? Why were his actions never challenged? Slowly, a picture began to form. Briggs had powerful protectors. Former officers who served alongside him described an unofficial brotherhood inside the department, a network of individuals who looked out for one another, erasing mistakes and covering tracks. Whenever a complaint was filed against Briggs, it was often handled by someone with personal ties to him. Body cam footage would go missing, statements would be rewritten, and victims would often be discouraged from pursuing charges. He was not just a rogue officer. He was part of the system. As news of Briggs's past became public, the outcry intensified. Protesters shifted their demands from suspension to criminal charges. Civil rights attorneys demanded a federal investigation into not just Briggs, but the department itself. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement was forced to get involved. The governor issued a statement promising transparency and accountability, though many doubted anything meaningful would happen. Meanwhile, Temka's civil lawsuit against the city gained traction. Her legal team released hospital photos showing the extent of her injuries, bruises, stitches, and swelling that painted a haunting picture of what had happened. Donations poured in for her medical care. National celebrities began speaking out, using their platforms to demand justice for her. The story had gone beyond Tallahassee. It had become a national symbol of a broken system. Inside the police department, morale plummeted. Officers were torn between loyalty to their own and fear of being associated with Briggs. Some began to distance themselves from him, leaking more documents and speaking off the record. A few even admitted that they had seen him use unnecessary force before, but had been too afraid to report it. Whispers of corruption and silence began to swirl. The thin blue line that had once protected Briggs was beginning to crack. And then, something strange happened. Briggs, who had remained mostly silent during the investigation, was reportedly planning to release a personal statement. According to one of his close colleagues, he had begun receiving threats. He was paranoid, anxious, and had started to skip mandatory check-ins. Surveillance around his home was quietly increased, though no official reason was given. Investigators believed he was hiding something, maybe a secret, maybe a deal gone bad. Whatever it was, he was not the confident, untouchable officer he had once appeared to be. With the spotlight fixed firmly on him and the public demanding answers, Briggs seemed cornered. But before anyone could hear his side of the story or see what secrets he held, the situation took a deadly and unexpected turn, one that would leave the city in shock all over again. Just 5 days after the violent arrest that left Tinka Rollins fighting for her life, a new headline sent shockwaves across Florida. Officer Nathaniel Briggs was found dead inside his home. The news broke early in the morning, first whispered through police radio chatter, then confirmed by an official statement from the department. Initial reports called it a suicide. Briggs had been discovered by a fellow officer during a wellness check, slumped over in his recliner with a single gunshot wound to the head. His service weapon lay on the floor beside him. The department expressed condolences to his family, calling him a dedicated officer and asking the public for privacy. But behind the carefully worded message, there was panic. The details didn't sit right with many. Briggs was right-handed, yet the bullet had entered from behind his right ear at a downward angle. The gun had no fingerprints on it, not even his. Forensics found no signs of a struggle, but the crime scene didn't fit the profile of a typical suicide. The curtains were drawn tightly, surveillance cameras around the home had been shut off the day before, and there were no notes or messages left behind. To some, it looked staged. Almost immediately, theories began circulating. Some believed it was suicide driven by guilt, fearing the legal consequences of his actions. Others suggested it was murder, an act of revenge, or part of a cover-up. The most disturbing theory was that someone within law enforcement had silenced him to prevent further damage. The public had already been skeptical of the department, and now, the sudden death of the man at the center of the controversy only fueled the belief that something much bigger was going on. The medical examiner's report was sealed from the public, further deepening suspicions. A week later, under increasing pressure, the case was reclassified as a possible homicide. This time, the investigation was turned over to an independent task force. Detectives combed through Briggs's digital life, searching for any clues: emails, messages, call logs. What they found was strange. Briggs had been in contact with someone using a burner phone, and those messages had been wiped just hours before his death. There were also several deleted files from his work laptop, including personnel reports and internal memos that may have referenced the Tameka Rollins case. More questions arose when it was revealed that Briggs had scheduled a private meeting with a journalist for the day after his death. He was reportedly preparing to disclose documents related to misconduct in the department, possibly as part of a plea deal or to shift blame. That meeting never happened. The journalist confirmed receiving vague texts from Briggs days earlier, expressing fear for his life and mentioning that "they're watching me now." He never explained who they were. Investigators searched his home for physical evidence. Hidden in a locked drawer, they found a flash drive labeled insurance. Encrypted and difficult to access, it was sent to cybercrime specialists for decryption. What was on it remained a mystery, but it was clear that Briggs was holding onto something important. Something worth killing for. In the public eye, Briggs had gone from villain to victim overnight. For some, it was justice served. For others, it was a warning about how deep the corruption really ran. Tameka remained unconscious, unaware that the man who had nearly taken her life was now dead. Her family stayed silent about Briggs's death, choosing instead to focus on her recovery and the civil case. But beneath the surface, in the offices of investigators and on the streets where protests still continued, a darker realization was settling in. If Briggs was silenced to protect a secret, then that secret was far bigger than anyone had imagined, and the people behind it were still out there, watching, waiting, and making sure their truth stayed buried. While the city grappled with the shocking death of Officer Nathaniel Briggs, the investigation into what truly happened behind closed doors began to dig deeper. The pressure was now on the newly assigned independent task force to uncover what Briggs knew, who he feared, and most importantly, who might have wanted him dead. As investigators began peeling back the layers of the department, they uncovered a web of silence and secrecy that pointed to something much more insidious than one rogue officer. At the heart of it all was the Tallahassee Police Department's long-standing culture of protection, secrecy, and quiet retaliation. Detective Marlene Hughes, a seasoned internal affairs officer brought in from another jurisdiction, began scrutinizing the timeline leading up to Briggs's death. She quickly focused her attention on Officer James Rucker, a fellow officer who had served closely with Briggs for the past 3 years. Rucker's name had appeared on an earlier complaint involving another case of excessive force, one that had mysteriously disappeared from the records. More troubling, Rucker had been seen at a gas station a few blocks from Briggs's house just 20 minutes before the estimated time of death. Rucker was questioned repeatedly, but claimed he had stopped by the gas station while heading home from his shift. He denied any involvement in Briggs's death and insisted he had nothing to hide. Yet when Hughes dug into his background, she discovered he had once filed anonymous internal reports warning that Briggs was becoming unstable and dangerous. Those reports had never been followed up on. In fact, they had been quietly erased from the system. Someone had deliberately scrubbed them. Further investigation uncovered text messages between Rucker and an unknown contact, sent in encrypted form through a secure messaging app. The contents were never fully recovered, but investigators traced one of the contacts to a higher-ranking supervisor within the department. That supervisor abruptly went on leave and refused all interviews. The department offered no explanation, and suspicion grew. As more officers were interviewed, a pattern emerged. Several admitted they had witnessed questionable behavior by Briggs in the past, but had been pressured to keep quiet. Those who tried to speak out had faced career setbacks, demotions, and social isolation within the force. There was an unspoken rule: protect your own, no matter the cost. The term "the Shield" came up repeatedly. It wasn't an official unit, but rather an informal group of officers who looked after each other, erased complaints, and manipulated evidence when needed. Over the years, they had grown powerful enough to control narratives, bury cases, and intimidate whistleblowers. Briggs had been one of their enforcers. He had handled dirty work, intimidated victims, and made sure nothing damaging reached the public. But once the Tamka Rollins incident exploded in the media and the department came under scrutiny, Briggs had become a liability. It was possible that he had threatened to expose others in an attempt to save himself. If that were true, then someone had acted quickly to make sure he never had the chance. At the same time, the encrypted flash drive found in Briggs's home was finally unlocked. Inside were dozens of confidential documents, emails, case files, edited footage, and even audio recordings. One recording stood out. It was a conversation between Briggs and another officer, discussing how evidence had been destroyed after a previous excessive force incident. The voice of the other officer was not yet identified, but the implications were clear. Briggs hadn't been acting alone. The truth was now undeniable. Briggs was part of a system designed to protect its own at all costs. His death wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a larger unraveling. Someone within the department had gone to extreme lengths to ensure silence. But now, that silence was cracking. And what lay beneath was far more dangerous than anyone had prepared for. The encrypted files from Nathaniel Briggs's flash drive sent shockwaves through the task force and confirmed many of the rumors that had been circulating. It wasn't just a matter of one officer stepping out of line. It was an entire structure built to protect those willing to bend the rules. The contents revealed years of coordinated efforts to hide misconduct, silence victims, and destroy evidence. Some names were familiar officers with a history of complaints and unexplained promotions. Others were more surprising, including ranking officials who had publicly condemned Briggs but were quietly linked to multiple cover-ups. As the files were cross-referenced with old case records, a chilling pattern emerged. Complaints were altered or erased, body cam footage was tampered with, and victims were often intimidated into withdrawing statements. For the first time, the so-called brotherhood inside the department had a face, a name, and now undeniable proof of its existence. Task Force, now backed by state and federal agencies, launched a formal investigation into the entire department. Subpoenas were issued, homes were searched, and several officers were placed on unpaid leave pending further review. But as the truth came into view, so did the risk. One of the detectives assigned to the task force was followed home late one evening. Another received an anonymous threat warning him to stop digging. It was becoming clear that not everyone was willing to let the past come to light. The Shield, though fractured, still had defenders, and they were watching. Meanwhile, Tamka Rollins regained consciousness. Though still weak and undergoing therapy, she was informed of what had happened in the days since her arrest, the national protests, the lawsuit, and most shockingly, the death of the man who had nearly taken her life. Her first request was for her children. Her second was to read the names of the officers mentioned in the investigation. She had no desire for revenge. What she wanted was protection for others like her, those who couldn't fight back, who had no cameras, who didn't survive. The civil suit brought forward by Tamka's family gained new momentum. With the contents of Briggs's files now public, the city faced intense scrutiny and legal consequences. Attorneys for the city attempted to settle quietly, but the family refused. They wanted the case to go to trial, for every lie to be exposed in a courtroom where the public could hear it. Tamka's story had become more than personal. It was a symbol of survival, resistance, and truth. Months later, the investigation concluded with multiple indictments. 5 officers were charged with obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. One high-ranking commander was arrested for falsifying reports and deleting body cam footage. Internal Affairs confirmed that over 20 cases involving excessive force had been mishandled or covered up. But not everyone involved was named. Some disappeared, resigned quietly, or retired with full benefits before charges could reach them. The shield, while broken, was not entirely dismantled. In the final days of the case, a memorial was